Oh, shit. Here we go again.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. This is your brother Leafy was here, and in today's video we're going to be going through part 3 of our lecture Refuting Orientalism. So the last parts dealt with Orientalism and Quranic studies. Now inshallah we're going to be refuting Hadith studies, first of all by giving a brief history of Hadith from a Western secular perspective, and then inshallah going through some of the key contentions that they bring up and the refutation or responses to those contentions. Make sure you guys like, comment, and subscribe. And without further ado, let's get straight into it. Now, before we get into the hadith itself, we have to understand the types or the categories of Orientalists. And this characterization is most explicit in a scholar named Wael al-Hallaq. Now, this is he's one of the great minds that is still alive today, and he critiques the revisionist school of thought. But let's look at his characterization of the Orientalists. So he says, since Schacht published his monumental work in 1950, scholarly discourse on this matter has proliferated. 3 camps of scholars may be identified, one attempting to reconfirm his conclusions and at times going beyond them, another endeavoring to refute them, and a third seeking to create a middle, perhaps synthesized position between the two. Among others, Wansbrough, Cook belong to the first camp, while Nadia, Abbott, Azami, Shula, and Fuck belong to the second. Motzki and Yonbol and the rest take a middle position. Now, he calls this issue, the authenticity of prophetic hadith, a pseudo-problem. Because he's saying that, look, the fact that you guys are even questioning the reliability of Muslim sources is so hypocritical. He calls it a pseudo-problem, right? And now, obviously, he takes the position that Schacht's conclusions are wrong, and he takes a neo-traditionalist view of the Islamic sources, and he praises them, and he says there's a lot we can learn from them. So he's very sympathetic to the Islamic tradition. Now let's jump into hadith criticism. So who are the Sunni hadith critics? So here we have the early generation of critics. So you have people like Az-Zuhri and Al-A'mash. Then you have second generation critics, people like Ash-Shu'ba, Malik, Ibn Uyayna. And third generation critics would be people like Al-Jarrah, Yahya ibn Sa'id al-Qattan, etc., and so on and so forth. These are the Sunni protagonists in terms of preserving hadith. In terms of companions who narrated hadith, these are the ones that narrated the most hadith. You have Abu Hurairah, Ibn Umar, Anas bin Malik, Aisha radiallahu anha, and Ibn Abbas radiallahu anhum ajma'een. Then we have a nice tree of corroboration, or how the traditional hadith scholarship viewed it, which is that you have a companion A, companion B. They both have a line of isnad that they both heard from the Prophet, and these lines ultimately get transmitted via subsequent successes. So you have a companion, then you have a tabi'i, then you have a tabi'i, and then ultimately it gets to the critic. So that would be, for example, Imam Malik, or anyone else for example, Imam Ahmad or whoever, right? And this is what corroboration looks like, right? This is the idea of corroboration. Now, Western scholarship basically starts with Goldziher. Now, before that, it's mainly polemical. Goldziher is the one who first begins, taking things kind of seriously, right? So who was Goldziher? Goldziher was a Hungarian scholar of Islam. He was Jewish. Alongside Schacht and Yonbol, he's considered one of the pioneers of the modern revisionist hadith studies. He was a devout Muslim at one point, writing in his journal that in those weeks, I truly entered into the spirit of Islam to such an extent that I ultimately became inwardly convinced that I myself was a Muslim, and judiciously covered that this was the only religion which, even in its doctrinal and official formulation, can satisfy philosophic minds. In Cairo, Goldziher even prayed as a Muslim. He says, in the midst of the tens of thousands of the pious, I rubbed my forehead against the floor of the mosque. Never in my life was I more truly devout than on that exalted Friday. Despite his love for Islam, he remained a Jew all his life, and he studied Islamic studies under the Ottoman Empire before its collapse. So again, you have kind of a weird character here. You have a love for Islam, and yet you're trying to refute it. So it's kind of a love-hate relationship here with this guy, with this Jew. Right, so what are Goldziher's main claims? So one, he starts from a radical skepticism. So he says that oral transmission plus late documentation of hadith make hadith subject to forgery. Secondly, he says that these later hadith represent communal agendas. That the early Muslims, they had, political, legal, sectarian interests, and that these interests are in the hadith, so therefore they corrupted the hadith with their sectarian interests or political interests or whatever. He then says that there are engines of fabrications. He says that the Umayyads offered state propaganda. The Abbasids likewise would do the same. Likewise, different political parties would. For example, the Shia of Ali or the group of Muawiyah, they would then fabricate hadith to try and, delegitimize the other party, etc., etc., right? He also uses the principle of analogy and anachronism as a litmus test. So he says that there are presumably many hadiths to the benefit of prevailing political tendencies. Many critics looked at only isnad, ignoring absurd matan. This is what he says. If you hear this goes back to Goldziher, where he says that, look, the muhaddithin only cared about the isnad, they didn't care about the matan. So hence, these anachronisms survived. And then pious forgery justified by ends over mean ethos. So scholars saw no wrong in attributing sound teachings to the Prophet for authority. So he's saying that the scholars had no issue, back projecting stuff to the Prophet. Now, Abbott Nadia Abbott is a Christian scholar, professor of Islamic studies, and in her work she refutes Goldziher and Goldziher's claims, and this is recorded in Brown's book. So he says, quote, Abbott presents an interesting challenge to Goldziher's theory that the Umayyad government, with agents like Az-Zuhri, instituted hadith collection and actively fabricated a substantial component of the hadith corpus pursuant to their political agenda. Evidence from our earlier sources on the origins of hadith study, Schacht stands, portrays the Umayyads as concerned first and foremost with the collecting of the Prophet's teachings on administrative issues like taxes and charity, not with material connected to the political image of their rule. She notes how the first stage attempt to collect hadith ordered by the Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz was limited to administrative hadiths. The hadiths that Zuhri collected for the Umayyads for promulgation in the provinces dealt only with charitable tithers. Right? Abbott argues that the family isnads like those from Nafi' ibn Umar, etc., like this isnad chain here, emerged far earlier and were far more numerous than previously imagined. Umayyad authors were attempting to make these private collections public, not ordering the forgery and circulation of baseless hadith. So Abbott refutes a lot of the assumptions and biases of Goldziher. Now, this is because Goldziher didn't actually look at the isnad, he just purely critiqued hadiths based on the matan. So what he would do is basically this is what he would do. He would look at a hadith and say, this looks pro-Umayyad, therefore must have been fabricated by the Umayyads. This hadith looks pro-Abbasid, therefore it must be fabricated by the Abbasids. This hadith, it looks pro-Shi'i, so it must be fabricated by a Shi'i. For example, he'd look at the hadith of Al-Thaqalain. Oh, this is clearly a pro-Shi'i hadith, therefore it must be fabricated by a Shi'i. This is basically his methodology. Now, obviously, this goes back to what we were saying before. Burden's view that if you can imagine a motive for something to be fabricated, it must be, fabricated. And this is absurd because, like my brother Farid from Farid Response says, by the way, make sure to subscribe to Farid Response, guys. What he says is, look, imagine you have a hadith of the Prophet eating chicken, right? The Prophet ate chicken. We have this hadith. That hadith is fabricated by someone who is a chicken shop owner, and he fabricated it to sell more chickens. You can do this with everything. This isn't like a scholarly objective method of discerning hadith versus what's authentic versus what's inauthentic. So you can do this kind of gymnastics with anything. So this isn't really a sound methodology whatsoever. Next we have Joseph Schacht. Now, Schacht is a much bigger name than Goldziher, but these two guys are usually lumped together. So who was Joseph Schacht? Joseph Schacht was a British-German professor of Arabic and Islam at the Columbia University in New York. He was the leading Western scholar in the areas of Islamic law and Hadith studies, his book Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence is still considered a central, important work to the subject. So you see this work being cited constantly because it is the work where most of his arguments against the criticism of Hadith is, and his methodology kind of becomes the blueprint or the orthodoxy for these Orientalists. And this is generally his theory. So he believes that you have the Prophet, you have a companion, a successor, and then you have a common link, right? A common link, someone who disseminated this hadith. This common link is the one who fabricated the hadith, right? And the transmitters are all getting the hadith from the common link, and the common link fabricates the chain back to the Prophet. So he didn't actually hear from the successor, he's just fabricating it. And this common link is usually alive in the 8th century. right? So it's usually around in the 750s or whatever, and he's back projecting this hadith to the Prophet, who lived almost 100 years before. This is his idea, and this is still what a lot of Orientalists believe, and it's based on a few key arguments of his. So these are his main claims. Hadiths are late constructs. Early jurists relied on community practice and senior scholars, not prophetic reports. There's a backgrowth of isnad as the debates intensified. So there were these debates between, for example, how to praise where to put your hand, where to not put your hand, or all these fiqh debates. And people would fabricate hadiths, according to him, to basically support their views on fiqh or on aqidah. So he tries to give examples of this in his work, and the transmitters initially would just cite companions. For example, one person would cite Ibn Abbas, another person would say, okay, he's the same thing, but it actually goes back to the Prophet. And they would cite later and later figures, eventually getting to the Prophet, to try and show that their position is more correct by citing a greater and greater authority. The common link test, he says that the first transmitter from whom a hadith fans out is likely the fabricator. Everything earlier in the chain is invented. He also dates things by silence. He uses his famous argument from silence, or argument isilentio, which says that if an earlier source could have used the hadith but didn't, the report probably did not exist, right? So what he says is that, look, if someone doesn't cite a hadith, then that means it didn't exist then. Very simply. And he does this, he uses this method broadly. So therefore he comes to the conclusion that, all hadith are fabricated because no one cites hadith early on. At least that's the claim. And as a rule of thumb, he says that the farther back the isnad goes, the later the fabrication. These are generally his main ideas or contributions to, the field of hadith, from the Western side, obviously. Okay, so how do we respond? First of all, the argument from silence is fallacious. Schacht doesn't demonstrate or differentiate the difference between a weak argument from silence and a deafening silence. The absence of a citation doesn't mean that the hadith doesn't exist. Just because someone doesn't cite something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Where do you get this idea from? Now, if we have a reason to suspect that they would have cited it and they don't cite it, that's a good argument from silence. But even then, that's still secondary. It's not a primary reason to dismiss something. Second of all, the legal basis, the legal text basis focuses on jurisprudential hadiths, may not apply to devotional or historical material. He also assumes linear documentation but neglects a robust oral circulation of outside of written works, right? And this is common that the muhaddithin themselves would speak about that. Look, when they taught a hadith in majalis, especially early on, they would speak orally because back then parchment was expensive. They didn't have paper. So they wouldn't have, a big collection of hadith. It's unreasonable to expect them to have these things. So hadith were memorized orally, either literally or bil ma'na, just in meaning. Early manuscripts, findings like Mustafa of Abdul Razzaq, show that prophetic isnads predate Ash-Shafi'i, challenging the backgrowth timeline. So this is empirical evidence that disproves his idea that Ash-Shafi'i is the one who came up with this framework of the prophetic sunnah, and he's the one who, basically settled this debate about which hadiths should be used and which hadiths shouldn't be used, etc., etc. But now we know that's nonsense. And this was refuted by Motzki. And then also he uses just circular reasoning. He says that the long isnad is forged, but it's also used as evidence that long isnads are forged. So long isnad must be forged, but using that long isnad is also evidence that long isnads are forged. So it's just circular reasoning and cherry-picking evidence. So the famous scholar who refuted him was Mustafa al-Azami, and we'll get to his work later, but first we'll read about what Jonathan Brown has to say about this. Now, Azami also accuses Schacht of fundamentally misunderstanding the realities of early Islamic legal scholarship. Schacht's argument from silence, where a scholar failing to mention a hadith or complete isnad meant that the hadith or that complete isnad must not have existed at that time, is flawed. A legal expert, a mufti, Azami argues, often answered questions without documenting the evidence he had used in arriving at his conclusions, or without providing a full isnad for his hadiths. Azami provides the example from Ash-Shafi'i's famous Risala, where Ash-Shafi'i provides an incomplete isnad for a hadith but excuses himself because he did not have with him the book that included his more complete isnad for that hadith. He also says here that the most basic objection to the revisionist recasting of the whole Muslim narrative for early Islamic history is that it asks us to believe too much. We might find it difficult to believe that Muslims could avoid all the pitfalls of historical manipulation, propagandization, and error in the collection of hadiths, but it seems even harder to believe that a scholarly community stretching from Spain to Central Asia and plagued by intense intersectarian conflicts could have orchestrated such a colossal historical conspiracy in a time of pre-modern communication. As Fred Donner notes, and he himself is a revisionist, he states in his rebuttal of the revisionists, he himself is one, by the way, but still, of the more extreme revisionists, I would say, it is inconceivable that the divided and decentralized early Muslim community could somehow orchestrate a comprehensive reduction of the Islamic tradition as a whole into a unified form without leaving ample historical evidence. Similarly, Harald Motzki notes that forgery of hadiths on the massive scale suggested by Orientalists and revisionists would have been prevented by the oversight of hadith scholars. So again, this idea of mass workshop forgers present in Yombol and Schacht is refuted by actual scholars like Motzki and even Donner. And again, this was echoed in the previous critique of Shoemaker that I showed. Now, here's Mustafa Azami's book, which I again recommend everyone to read this book on Schacht, Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence. He absolutely cooks Schacht, and he gives examples of hadith that are earlier than the one that Schacht cites, which have the complete isnad. Right, so it completely refutes Schacht's methodology and treatment of the hadith corpus. Malik records the opinions of his immediate teachers, such as Nafi', Zuhri, and others, right? In Schacht's view, the doctrines ascribed to these early authorities cannot be taken as genuine, but they are only a device used, quote, in order to justify doctrines which reflected the current practice or which were meant to change it. He further notes that these efforts were sometimes successful in bringing about a change, but often not. It might be theoretically possible to accept this view if the Medianese always followed the early authorities, but as we have seen, Malik was sometimes in agreement and sometimes in disagreement with the authorities he quoted. If we were falsely ascribing doctrines to these authorities to bring about changes in the doctrine of the school, he would not then contradict what he himself had just fabricated. Was he perhaps under some kind of pressure that would not allow him to formulate his own doctrines as he wished, but would make him want to pass on the relevant information to later authorities? There is no evidence that this kind of situation existed, and in fact, there is abundance of evidence to the contrary. We may find many scholars changing their decisions whenever the weight of evidence indicates that they may have been wrong in the first place. Malik himself changed his doctrines continuously, as for example regarding his opinion about this specific issue. So what he's noting here, the details are not that important, but what's important is the main point here, and this is reiterated again by Motzki. Motzki agrees with this claim. He says, look, if these people were fabricating things, why are they disagreeing with their early authorities? If he's fabricating it, then it shows that it's genuine. If he was fabricating it, then why would he disagree with his early authorities, right? Because he's not fabricating it, that's why there's disagreement. That's the only way it would make sense. Because if he was fabricating it, he would have, there's no need, you're disagreeing with who? Who are you disagreeing with? You're fabricating it. There's no one to disagree with. So why would you concoct a fake situation to disagree with? Or a fake opinion to disagree with, unless the transmissions are genuine, which Motzki also shows, like, look, this is an evidence of genuine transmission. So Azami also goes on to state, perhaps what is most damning as far as Schacht's reliance on Margot Luth goes, is that Margot Luth's references are dated from the first half of the 1st century. If Schacht accepted these references as authentic, he would also have to accept the fact that the expressions of the term Sunnah of the Prophet was widely used as 100 years before he contended it was. Because remember, Schacht's dating things to the 8th century, and he's saying Ash-Shafi'i is the one who concocted this use of the prophetic Sunnah, or the Sunnah of the Prophet. Before the term, he says before that the term Sunnah was just, a generic term. It didn't mean specifically the Sunnah of the Prophet. This was later invented and back projected. This is what he says. But again, this is refuted, and the own scholars he cites also refute him as well. It is worthwhile to note here that the excellent inclusions of brave men, whose works was first available to me only when this book was going to press, and which I have therefore not been able to draw on as heavily as otherwise might have been the case. According to brave men, Margot Luth assumes that the practice of the Prophet in which the early times is most frequently mentioned in the reference to Uthman was not yet anything quite definite, but merely what was customary. That is, the practice of the Muslims or of the community with respect to this theory must be stated that the very specific term Sirat Rasulullah, which is used in Uthman's oath of office for the practice and procedure of the Prophet, makes it perfectly clear what is meant by the expression the practice of the Prophet, right? So again, he gives an example of an early hadith that is reliable, where the word sunnah or the prophetic sunnah is used with exactly in the same way that we use it now, which completely undermines Schacht's view that this idea of prophetic sunnah was developed over time and then culminated with a Shafi'i. This is completely stupid, ahistorical, been refuted, but yet you'll still hear revisionists regurgitate this nonsense because they need orthodoxy to develop. Again, it's built into their method. So here what Azami does is go on to further refute Schacht's understanding of the term sunnah and his account of early Islamic history. I won't read the whole thing, but he gives examples here where Schacht misunderstands and misreads the hadiths that he uses, right? And he comes to the conclusion that, for example, thus sunnah he refers to the practice of the Prophet. It is therefore clearly wrong to use this as an example of the Iraqians using the term sunnah when they can show no relevant tradition. He says the same is true of the second example. He goes on to explain it, and he says, moreover, Schacht has mistranslated the passages. Schacht has mistranslated the passage. The Iraqians did not say, this is the sunnah which is not in the Quran. No one claims that the Quran is the repository of the sunnah. What Schacht has done is to join two sentences with which, thus changing the sentence. The original text is, وَهَذَا سُنَّةْ غَيْرِ الْقُرْآنِ وَغَيْرِ الشَّهَادَاتِ. Right? This is a sunnah, i.e. a derived ruling from the sunnah, and is neither derived from the Quran, nor does it come from the category of bearing witness, which is mentioned in the Quran. Right? Schacht has therefore failed to prove his point that the concept of the sunnah in the ancient books of law was not identical with the content of the traditions from the Prophet. While the word sunnah was certainly used for things other than the prophetic tradition, in the majority of cases, it denoted the sunnah of the Prophet and not the living tradition. Moreover, the sunnahs of the Prophet were given binding authority over any legal precedences or opinions. He also gives a nice little conclusion which you guys can read, but I'm going to skip over it for the sake of time. Other scholars like Calder also agree, critiquing Schacht's position on the development of this term, saying that it's only partially true what he's saying. Similarly, we have another scholar here, Sulaiman Muhammad, and he says that M. Braveman devotes an extensive chapter to the concept of sunnah in his book, The Spiritual Background of Early Islam. In this chapter, he contends that the concept of Sunnat Rasulullah, the sunnah of the Prophet, is a very early and genuine Islamic idea, and that it cannot be considered as based on later doctrinal considerations. So here we have Al-Halaq, and he says, quote, more recent research, however, has shown that Schacht's findings were largely incorrect, and that the point which Islamic law came to contain all its major components must be dated to around the middle of the 4th century, an entire century earlier than had originally been assumed. The early and medieval Muslim scholars espouse the view that the prophetic hadith literature is substantially genuine, and that despite the relatively large-scale forgery that took place in the early period, the literature, at least as it came to be constituted in the so-called canonical collections, has been successfully salvaged and finally proven to be authentic. It is only against this backdrop of traditional religious assumptions that the modern controversy can make any sense, for if the mainstream traditional scholarship was perceived not to have made claims for the authenticity of hadith, there would be little, if anything, to argue against. In fact, if these were not the perceived traditional claims, there would have been no controversy to begin with, since the issue would in no way pose a problem. One would expect that before any ink had been spilt in commenting on the platform of authenticity, it would have been a fundamental requirement first to define the traditional Muslim position with regards to this specific question. If mainstream Muslim scholarship considered the hadith literature to be a true representation of the actual words of the Prophet, then by what epistemological yardstick did they measure the veracity of that literature? Furthermore, we should have asked before Goldziher, Schacht and their like began to expend so much scholarly energy in treating the matter, how the traditional Muslim criteria for judging the authenticity of the hadith tally with, or more importantly, epistemologically differ from our modern critical and scholarly criteria. In this short essay, I argue that the scholarly output concerned with authenticity, since Well raised the issue a century and a half ago, is largely, if not totally, pointless. I have no new evidence to add to the massive repertoire of existing material, and nothing in my methodology here is unconventional. In fact, I shall, insofar as an author can minimize the divide between his sources and his reader, let the traditional position speak for itself. Once that position is clarified and defined, we will be able to conclude that the traditional Muslim scholars have already solved the problem for us, and that we have needlessly expended much scholarly effort because we have not listened carefully to what these scholars have for so long been telling us. So he's saying this whole point, this whole methodology of Schacht, Goldziher, I'm going to get to Yoimbal now, their whole approach is useless, because the idea is that we need to recover the historical material. Muslim scholars are lying to us, they didn't do a good job, and that what is in the Hadith books is obviously not authentic. But he's saying this is a fruitless endeavor, it's a pointless endeavor, because the Muslim scholars have already done this, but you guys are too arrogant to see that. You're too arrogant to see, the Western revisionists, they're too arrogant to see that the Muslim scholars have already dealt with this with great detail, in their own literature, on their own grounds, with their own epistemology. So why would you need to now reinvent the wheel? He says it's a pointless endeavor, right? And he also says that Schacht's theories are largely incorrect, that his dating is largely incorrect. His theories about hadith being mass fabricated are, of course, incorrect. Very little of his new ideas were actually true. So Halak says, quote, "To sum up, Western scholarship has concentrated its attention upon an area of traditional Muslim discourse that is not particularly instructive. The traditionalist discourse is stated in terms that are largely incongruent with the epistemic evaluation of the hadith, an evaluation that is directly relevant and indeed central to the Islamist paradigm of historical research. If minimal traces of this epistemic interest are to be found in the traditional discourse, it is because legal theory commanded a measure of attention from the traditionalists. The epistemic evaluation of the hadith was finely articulated and elaborated by the legal theoreticians and jurists, and it is this area of traditional discourse that Western scholars should have begun their inquiry, if such an inquiry need be embarked upon at all." Again, further reiterating that, look, these guys should come with epistemic humility. They should understand that our scholars did it first. They did it better. You're learning from our scholars. If you want to, if you take issue with some of their findings, that's fine. But you have to do it from a place of humbleness, of sincerity, not with this arrogance, with this type of epistemic colonization, with this Orientalist framework that's biased and flawed, right? Now, going on to Yoimbal. Now, Yoimbal is another one of these revisionists who basically carries the torch from Goldziher, and his main work is the Encyclopedia of Canonical Hadith, and he's a specialist in Hadith, right? He's basically the new Don. Now, how did Yoimbal build upon the ideas of Schacht and Goldziher? First of all, what he did. Common link dating. The first transmitter for whom a hadith spreads into multiple lines is the terminus post quem, which is the backgrowth, the guy who did the backgrowth. The more people narrated the hadith from a scholar, the more historicity that moment has. Okay, diving and spider isnads. So he introduced this concept of diving and spider isnads. So diving chains are alternative routes invented to shorten or elevate the isnad. A spider is a set of unrelated single strand chains which are historically worthless. It never ceases to, this is a quote from him, he says, "It never ceases to astonish me that master Muslim scholars fail to see these corroborating isnads were groundless fabrications." Right, and he also uses the same argument from silence. Even if an early jurist, for example Ibn Juray, omits a hadith that would have helped him, then that means the report didn't exist. He says that there was pervasive tadlis, that most transmitters embellished their authorities, yet most Muslim critics hardly ever caught it. And again, he shares the same a priori doubt that is common to the revisionist school. Now, here's a nice diagram from Brown's book where he explains it very nicely. So what he has is the same idea. So you have the common link, he's the one who fabricated the hadith, and then you have a partial common link, transmitter, and then you have the collectors. So for example, this would be Bukhari, Abu Dawood, Tirmidhi, and these are the ones collecting the hadith. Now there'll be a chain that bypasses the common link, right? So if he fabricated it, how is there a chain that bypasses him? Well, this is Yoimbal's answer. Well, that's a dive. Right? These are dive isnads invented by a later collector or transmitter as an alternative to the isnad of the common link. So this is a way of bypassing the common link. So all the hadiths that don't mention the common link, clearly they're also fabricated, they're also back projections. And now again, this is an ad hoc way of basically justifying the idea that the hadith are unreliable, but we'll get to it. So here Brown says, quote, "The large-scale analysis of transmission and fundamental questioning of Orientalist and revisionist assumptions has continued in force in the scholarship of German Harald Motzki. In a sense, Motzki is the first Western scholar who treats hadith with the same respect as Muslim hadith masters did. Like figures such as Ibn Hajar al-Asqalani, his judgments about hadiths depend upon collecting all the available narrations of the report, not just the ones easily accessible in well-known collections. Motzki's work offers three main criticisms of previous Western hadith scholarship. First, he argues that the argument from silence relied upon by Schacht, Youngball and Krohn is invalid. Second, he demonstrates that common links are much earlier than previously thought, dating some to around the time of the companions in the second half of the 7th century. Finally, Motzki argues, rather than being consummate forgers of hadith, major hadith transmitters such as Zuhri and Ibn Jubayr were generally reliable in passing on reports from the previous generation. Orientalists and revisionists had relied on the premise that an early scholar's failure to employ a prophetic hadith or the best possible version of that hadith in a debate in which it could have been used proves that this hadith did not exist at the time or in that form. Motzki argues that this assumption is both unreasonable and inaccurate. Again, the same criticism as Al-Azami. A scholar could decide not to mention a hadith because he did not feel that it addressed the issue at hand, especially in the time of early legal synthesis like Abu Hanifa and Malik. Hadiths were still distributed regionally. We saw the example of Malik's Egyptian student informing him of reliable hadith about washing one's feet that Malik, who never left the Hijaz, had never heard. As for the assumption that if a hadith was transmitted via only one isnad in the early period, then it must have been forged, Motzki argues that we should not expect to find numerous isnads from figures like the successors of back to the Prophet. Isnads, after all, came into use during the successors generation in the late 600s/early 700s. Even for those early hadith transmitters and scholars who provided isnads to the Prophet at that time, it was only necessary to provide one isnad for a Prophet, not a bundle as became common later in the second half of the 700s and the 800s. As for Youngball's argument that Muslims obsessively transmitted hadiths with hundreds of students attending their teachers' dictation sessions, common sense tells us that there are many reasons why history preserved one person's transmission from that teacher instead of those many students. Just as only a small percentage of a teacher's students go on to become teachers themselves, so it is not inconceivable that only one of the hadith transmitted students would go on to become a transmitter as well. Youngball had argued that only the transmission of one to many can be considered a historically documented moment in the life of a hadith, but Motzki counters, if we only consider transmission from one person to a number of people historically reliable, then why do we have only a few hadiths or partial common links in that form? If we have established that the hadith came into existence with a common link, and that any hadith that actually existed must have been transmitted by all those who heard it from a teacher, then after the common links, we should find thousands of chains of transmission in the 4th and 5th generations. The fact that we find so few partial common links strongly suggests that common links and partial common links were the exception rather than the rule in the transmission of hadith. Their absence thus cannot be construed as a proof for the hadith's non-existence at that time. So here Motzki, who's a German scholar, the dean of hadith, he retired recently. He's one of the, like Brown says, he's pretty much the first scholar in the Western tradition to take hadiths seriously and to look at them from an objective standpoint, though still confined by HCM. And he treats them with much more respect, as you'll go on to see. Refuting Youngball. Now Youngball, I forgot to mention, is also one of these like Orientalists who is like a revisionist. He also laments that why don't more Muslims believe in like the arguments of Joseph Schacht. I mean, I've just shown you how like ridiculous and problematic they are, and how Motzki refutes them, Al-Azami refutes them, Abbott refutes them, and the own scholars he cites refute him. So, I mean, we don't accept Schacht's arguments because Schacht's arguments are weak and have been shown to be empirically false, as Halaq has shown, as Motzki has shown. But here the main issue is the three things that Motzki refutes them on. One, the argument from silence is fallacious, that Schacht, Youngball and Krohn use. He demonstrates that common links are earlier than Schacht thought, and they go back to the companions. Often they go back to the companions in the second half of the 7th century, which shows that they use the snad. This backs up the traditional narrative and refutes the revisionist one. And he argues that rather being consummate forgers of hadith, major transmitters like Ma'mar, Ibn Juray, Zuhri were actually historically reliable because they wouldn't fabricate hadith and then contradict themselves later on. He does a rigorous analysis, which I'm going to quote later on. So next, Motzki critiques Schacht and Youngball's revisionist methodology. He says, quote, One of Motzki's central criticisms of Schacht's and Yonbor's work is the small number of sources from which they drew hadiths in determining the common link. For you guys who are remembering, the common link is the node to which all the transmitters come to before going in a straight line to the Prophet, supposedly, right? In collecting transmissions of a hadith to locate a common link, for example, Yonbor relied principally on Tahafut al-Ashraf of Jamal ad-Din al-Mizzi, a work that collects together all the chains of transmission for a hadith but is limited to the traditions and transmissions found in the 6 books, right? Motzki draws on a much larger and more diverse body of sources, including earlier ones, such as the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani, and later ones, such as the one of al-Bayhaqi. By consulting a much wider range of sources than these earlier scholars, Motzki demonstrates that the common links for the hadiths he analyzes actually belong to the time of the companions in the second half of the 7th century. And he gives an example. Motzki lays out his rebuttal of Schacht's and Yonbor's common link forger argument most clearly in an article devoted to studying the hadiths related to the Prophet's order that a prominent Jewish leader in Khaybar, Ibn Abi Huqayq, should be assassinated, right? By gathering together a tremendous array of chains of transmission from a wide variety of sources, Motzki demonstrates that this hadith has not one common link, but several who are working independently and thus must have relied on some earlier common source. In the case of the killing of Ibn Abi Huqayq, Motzki concludes that the common link transmitter of hadiths relating to the event probably received their reports no later than the last third of the 7th century. The hadith was circulating during the time of the companions. Now, this is amazing for multiple reasons. It's amazing because he challenges their assumptions. He shows with examples how these assumptions are problematic. He shows how they overgeneralize based on a limited number, a limited sample size, and he gives counterexamples to show that the hadith are actually authentic to the time of the companions. Now, it's very hard for revisionists now to do their ad hoc reconstruction, because how are you going to say that, okay, the hadith was there during the time of the companions, but it's not authentic? It's a hard sell. It doesn't really make sense. Most likely, if the companions have the hadith circulating around, then it does go back to the Prophet. There is a genuine historical memory there. So again, this is very problematic from the revisionist perspective. He gives another example where Motzki uses the same thing and he refutes him on that, so you guys can read that. I'm going to skip it for the sake of time. But based on this evidence, Motzki argues that Abdul Razzaq and Ibn Jurayj both faithfully transmit the material they received, since there is little likelihood that the hadiths narrated by Ibn Jurayj from Atta were forged. They can be seen as authentic representations of Muslim legal scholarship in Mecca and in the late 7th and early 8th centuries. So again, he's reinforcing the authenticity of the transmitters and of the authenticity of hadith. A general point here: certainly, Muslim hadith critics differ from modern Western criticism in that they believe the Prophet could know the future, because we don't believe in HCM. We believe miracles are possible, and thus genuine foretellings of future events are also possible. But perhaps Western scholars could benefit from their cautious approach. Western reasoning for why the hadith about visiting the 3 mosques must be forged rested on the fact that it seemed to promote an Umayyad agenda, and that Az-Zuhri, who was associated with the Umayyad court, is in the Isnad. Right? So here the idea is we're going to reject it because it's pro-Umayyad. Zuhri is in the chain. Zuhri is in the pockets of the Umayyads. So clearly he's forging pro-Umayyad propaganda. Right? This is the thought process. But Brown responds, but there are other isnads for this hadith that do not have Az-Zuhri in them. Should we reconsider our conclusions or assume quite without reason that these other isnads were forged as well? And the answer to that from people like Little and Schacht and Yonbor would yes, we should assume that these also were forged and that they're dives or spliders or whatever, but they're not authentic, right? And this is, again, unreasonable. That Aqsa Mosque is mentioned in the Quran, so it's so inconceivable that the Prophet would order his followers to pay special attention to it, along with the Haram Mosque in Mecca, and his mosque in Medina. There is a certain chicken and egg logic to the Western approach to the reliability of hadith, and this is very evident. Like I said, with the example of the chicken shop, the Prophet ate chicken. Is that so hard to believe? Is that so inconceivable? Is that so unreasonable to say that the historical Prophet ate chicken? No, but yet they would have to say, the hadith is forged because there's a theory, there's a motive, etc., etc. And here the same thing with the hadith talking about Masjid al-Aqsa. It's the same thing. Is it that inconceivable that the Prophet would want the Muslims to attend to it, to be wary of it, etc., etc.? It isn't, but according to the Western methodology, they're forced to be skeptical of it. which just shows the how flawed the methodology actually is. In another article in 1991, Motzki continues to use the Musannaf of Abd al-Razzaq as a tool to correct Schacht's conclusions about early Islamic legal hadiths, in particular legal material ascribed to the famous Az-Zuhri. Now, Az-Zuhri is someone who is problematized by Yonbul, and Yonbul again says, he's in the pocket of the Umayyads, therefore, we have to be skeptical towards him and his material, clearly it's forged, etc., etc. Motzki compares the legal hadiths narrated by Az-Zuhri's students Ma'mar and Ibn Juray from their teacher with material found in the book of another of Zuhri's students, Malik, by proving that both the hadiths from Ma'mar and Ibn Juray and Malik come from a common source, presumably Az-Zuhri. Motzki suggests that the material attributed to Zuhri actually came from him, especially in the case of Ma'mar and Ibn Juray. Their narrations bear no signs of intended forgery. These scholars drew on a very diverse range of sources, and they readily transmitted hadiths or scholarly opinions that disagreed with their own stances. If they were using these transmissions as a means to promote their own legal agenda, why would they not transmit reports that disagreed with them? Exactly. So if Zuhri is fabricating hadith, why would he narrate a hadith that he disagrees with? Presumably, Zuhri wants to make his legal rulings, whatever they are, the norm. He's citing them for the purpose of winning the legal debate, right? Well, if that's the purpose for you to fabricate the hadith, then why would you cite the counterexample to your hadith or hadiths that disagree with you? Doesn't make sense. Unless you're actually engaging with genuine material and you're not forging hadith. Then it would make sense. So again, this shows the genuine transmission of people like Az-Zuhri, Ma'mar, Ibn Juray, and the early Muhaddithin. Motzki devotes special attention to a bizarre report that Az-Zuhri attributes to one of the Prophet's companions who allowed grown men to become related to women by breastfeeding them, right? By establishing the transmission from Az-Zuhri, then showing that the material that Az-Zuhri reported was itself compiled from several sources, Motzki argues that the common link for this report is in fact the companion who supposedly said it in the second half of the 7th century. That Az-Zuhri personally disagreed with the companion's rulings he transmits because he didn't approve of the practice of grown men suckling, testifies to his integrity as a transmitter. So again, he's giving you an example where he narrates an opinion that he disagrees with, but yet in doing so he shows that he's a genuine transmitter. Or at least it becomes very unreasonable to accuse him of fabricating hadith en masse. So here Brown cites analyzing Muslim tradition, so I thought it'd be nice to go back to the primary source where Motzki makes his conclusions and see his reasoning firsthand. So this is what he says on page 24. The correspondence between early biographical traditions about Malik and the results we obtained by investigating Malik's transmission from his teachers as contained in the Muwatta corroborates my assumption that Malik-Zuhri traditions in the Muwatta are genuine, i.e. their content really does go back to Zuhri. They deserve our trust until the contrary is proven, not the opposite as Schacht demanded. So again, he's dismantling this a priori doubt, that this Schachtian skepticism that prevails the Western Academy of Hadith. He goes on to say, these facts provide evidence against the suspicion held by Schacht and others that the traditions labelled as Zuhri transmissions in the Hadith emerged only after his death, and that they were falsely ascribed to him and happened to reach the authors of our 3 compilations by oral transmission. Firstly, the body of Zuhri traditions is too large to fit this theory. Secondly, the period of time between Zuhri's death in 124 and the publication of our 3 authors' compilations is too short. They probably composed their works sometimes before their deaths. Ibn Juray was already dead by 150 and Ma'mar died 153. Imam Malik's Muwatta must have existed around 150 at the latest because Shaybani, who was born in 132, probably received his version of the Muwatta as a young student of Malik's, according to the biographical reports at the age of 20. The year 150 can be considered, therefore, the terminus antiquum of the existence of all 3 compilations, but most probably they had already been compiled much earlier. If this is accepted, it remains difficult to explain how the 3 authors who lived far away from one another came into possession of this huge number of texts, which are similar in content but often vary in wording, if one assumes at the same time that these texts were forged by others. Finally, it seems a very odd coincidence that each of the 3 compilers suppressed their real informants or their common sources as if they had agreed to this fraud. So he's giving examples and reasons for why we should to support the idea that these transmissions are genuine transmissions. First, he says that the body of Zuhri traditions is too large to be fabricated on this scale, especially for this time. Secondly, the period between Zuhri's death, the chronology just doesn't make sense for it to be fabrication and back projection. There isn't enough time for that. Thirdly, the position of these three students is much too far to all be in on the same conspiracy. So if one takes into consideration these points, it becomes very, very, very unreasonable for you to insist on fabrication. You can only do that because of your methodology. You have to assume our sources are fabricated in order to do your reconstruction, your revisionist reconstruction. So again, this goes to show the reliability of our hadith tradition. Next, he considers the Ibn Jurayj traditions, and he says, quote, "Our investigation of the evidence concerning Ibn Jurayj, which can be found in biographical literature, leads on the whole to a picture very similar to the one we could outline on the basis of his text. This could lead to the supposition that the biographical traditions could have been extrapolated from the texts. However, there is hardly any evidence for such a claim. Only the later voluminous lists of teachers and pupils as we find them, for example in Ibn Hajar's Tahdib, probably arose at least partially in that way. Thus, on the basis not only of Ibn Jurayj's text, but also on the biographical information on him, which goes back for the most part to his students, we are justified in considering his Zuhri transmissions authentic in the sense that he in fact received the text from Az-Zuhri." Talking about Nafi''s transmissions, he says, "Our comparison of the text corpora of Malik's most important informants leads us to the conclusion that we must assume Malik's transmissions from both An-Nafi' and Zuhri really derive from them until the contrary is proven." Again, reinforcing the idea of the reliability of hadiths, because we have a golden chain from Nafi' and from Malik and Nafi' and Ibn Umar, who said, the Prophet, peace be upon him, said. This is a golden chain. So if we assume that Malik's transmission from An-Nafi' is authentic and that Zuhri's transmission from An-Nafi' is also authentic, this is problematic. So it's not like the revisionists are not aware of this evidence or this research by Motzki. They are in fact indeed aware of it. So what do they say about it? Well, Yumbo basically copes by saying that, look, Nafi' didn't even exist. Nafi' is someone who was made up by Malik in order to back project hadith on them. And all the muhaddithin were in on it. Now, I'll just let you sit with that and just realize how absurd that is. You're claiming that Nafi' didn't even exist as a person and that all the muhaddithin were in on it. Now, this is unlikely for multiple reasons, but the simplest one is very easy. Ibn Ishaq and Malik were actually, they had a little bit of a beef. They didn't like each other. This is well known, right? We have reports of this. But Ibn Ishaq narrates from Nafi' from Ibn Umar in his seerah, and the quote is there. Ibn Ishaq, like I said, he hated Malik. But according to Yumbal, they were all in on the same plot of, they all conceded that, okay, we're just going to agree for the sake of argument that Nafi' is a real person. We're all just going to quote him even though he doesn't exist. It seems unlikely. If these people couldn't agree on other issues, what would make you think that they would agree on this mass conspiracy? It's very, very implausible. But this is the level of cope that they have to resort to, which speaks volumes about how bad their method is. Right. Motzki continues. He says, as a consequence, until the contrary is proven, we must consider Zuhri and Qatada texts as authentic, i.e. really derived from the persons named. The attempt to avoid this consequence by assuming that a part of Ma'mar's material, the traditions from later authorities, is the work of anonymous forgers, as Schacht argued, is not convincing. These forgers would have been Ma'mar's contemporaries, i.e. active in the second quarter of the 2nd century, and they must have produced Zuhri and Qatada traditions in huge numbers. These workshop forgers could not have remained undetected by long-serving students of Zuhri and Qatada. There is, however, no hint of such workshops either in Ma'mar or his pupil Abdul Razzaq's texts. And then he goes on to summarize his conclusions. In the view of the results gained by a source-critical study of the early transmissions from Az-Zuhri in general, and of two traditions transmitted from him in particular, one referring to Umar, the other to the Prophet, Schacht's method and ideas about the origins of Islamic jurisprudence are questionable. To summarize the arguments presented in the article, let us return to the starting point. According to the view decisively shaped by the writings of Joseph Schacht, and since then among Western scholars of Islam, so people like, again, Yoimbal and Little and Crone, the number of reliable legal traditions going back to Ibn Shihab Az-Zuhri is very small. It must be limited to the information about Zuhri's Ray, which Malik in his Muwatta explicitly said he heard himself or asked Zuhri about. This view has been challenged in this article. Apart from the Muwatta, Other early sources that have become available since the publication of Schacht's Origins that can be used for a reconstruction of Zuhri's legal doctrines and traditions. A source-critical study of the earliest sources now available shows that the number of texts that can be attributed to Zuhri is much higher than Schacht thought. A comparison of the Zuhri texts preserved in early sources leads to the conclusion that his legal teaching did not consist of Ray alone, but also included, for an important part, traditions about the legal opinions and practice of the preceding generations of Muslims, successors, companions, and the Prophet, on the basis of the numerous legal texts that Zuhri's students transmitted in their compilations. A detailed picture of his jurisprudence can be drawn. But what is more, the state of development which Islamic jurisprudence had reached in the first quarter of the 2nd century can be reconstructed, and even the preliminary stages of the 1st century. Right? So again, this all reaffirms the reliability of hadith and that the muhaddithin were authentic when they transmitted the hadith, contrary to the opinions of the revisionists, Schacht, Joinbol, Goldziher, and the rest of the revisionist crew. Motzki summarizes his findings very simply in his work, the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq as-San'ani, as a source of authentic hadith for the 1st century AH. In the beginning, he says, quote, Goldziher's thesis that the traditions ascribed to the Prophet and the companions contained in the classical collections of hadith are not authentic reports of these persons, but rather reflect the doctrinal political developments of the first 2 centuries after Muhammad's death, is based primarily on the analysis of the content of the hadith, the matan, and not the transmitters, right? And the conclusions, after a rigorous analysis has been done, and he shows that the people transmitting are reliable, contrary to the opinions of the revisionists and to the opinions of himself, because he had been led to believe that these people were correct and that hadith are useless. Basically, he says, quote at the end: while studying the Musannaf of Abdul Razzaq, I came to the conclusion that the theory championed by Goldziher, Schacht, and in their footsteps many others, which included myself, which in general rejects hadith as a literature, as a historical reliable source for the 1st century AH, deprives the historical study of early Islam of an important and useful type of source. It goes without saying that this material cannot be regarded as completely truthful, but this even the Muslims themselves did not claim. So he's agreeing with us that the hadith are useful, the hadith are authentic, they can be used to reconstruct the opinions of Muslims early on up to the Sahaba and even to the Prophet, but that doesn't mean that all hadiths are reliable. But this is not even what the Muslim claim is. We claim that we have our own method of sifting through hadith, and that method is correct, authentic, and accurate, and that it works, right? It's worked for 1,400 or 300 years, right? So this is our position. We don't say all hadith are reliable ipso facto. No, that's not the case. And the muhaddithin's job is to catch these hadith.
Finally, we have some nice quotes from a paper by another prominent scholar. She says, quote, many Orientalists are also of the opinion that the burden of proof lies with the skeptical scholars. For example, David Powers states that until skeptics have convincingly demonstrated that a significant number of reports attributed to the Prophet are not authentic, the burden of proof should continue to lie on those who deny authenticity. Long before Powers, Johann Fock, in his review of Schacht's Origins of Muhammadan Jurisprudence, criticized the skepticism in the book and pointed out that while extreme skepticism was abandoned in other disciplines, generalizations still exist in Islamic studies. Like Fock, who on the basis of Ibn Ishaq's Sirah objected to Schacht drawing generalizations, Montgomery Watt too also argued that historical material should be accepting as having a solid core of fact unless a reason is adduced to the contrary. In his review of Patricia Crone's Meccan Trade, Sargent, another scholar of Islamic history, goes beyond what's somewhat blurry classification between historical and legal material and observes that, quote, methodologically, we cannot but start from the premise that a tradition is a genuine report of fact until it is credibly shown to be false, or partially or wholly invalidated by palpable bias. Echoing David Powers' view that the burden of proof lies with skeptical scholars, Harald Motzki notes that adopting a premise about authenticity/inauthenticity of traditions is only possible after having dated a large number of ahadith, and the Western hadith studies have so far not reached a stage allowing its scholars to make these kinds of generalizations. Although he is right about Western hadith studies, it is self-evident that Muslim scholars hold this privilege since they analyzed and categorized the hadith based on their methodology, some of whose constituents can be traced to Imam al-Shafi'i's Risala. If this methodology is deemed failing, giving rise to the claim that Hadith literature should be analysed anew, then it appears to be obvious who bears the responsibility of proving these claims. In addition, as Sargent rightly puts, the purpose of criticism of sources is to deduce the acceptable data, not to destroy them. Scholars, starting from the principle that traditions cannot be accepted as authentic until the contrary is proven, focus their energy on proving the unreliability of sources, and in doing so neglect to demonstrate how these sources should be rightfully used. Speaking of the skeptical scholars like the clown Joshua Little and his ilk. Finally, she ends with this quote. She says, although Christopher Melchurch, who is one of the most influential revisionist scholars, he argues that Al-Azami is a dogmatist. He says this because he's a Muslim and he's defending the tradition. He also says, to be fair, that this does not rule out that Schacht was also a dogmatist. In other words, as Halak rightly states, the Orientalist paradigm is no less ideological than Islamic scholarship. Both are ideologies, both are making claims, both require justification, but only one is willing to give the justification. She goes on to say, the fact that both sides have certain assumptions and premises and take some propositions for granted fuels a debate in which scholars are attempting to convince each other. Certainly, it is not the intention of this study to deny the value of this debate or to exclude the possibility that scholars from both sides might set forth some definite proofs which will compel the other camp to accept them. It does imply, however, that a consensus between the two paradigms is not likely and that the search for a common paradigm even is a pointless task. Therefore, the emergence of a new synthesis or a full-scale paradigm shift in Kunst terminology should not be expected. Yet despite all of this, researchers from different scholarly traditions are able to benefit from each other's studies, for in most cases it is possible to separate a scholar's findings from his or her interpretations of those findings. In bearing this separation in mind, Muslim researchers should attempt to find explanations for Orientalist findings according to the classical Islamic paradigm. We should not abandon our own paradigm in search of theirs. We should defend our paradigm as rigorously as possible. Alright, so that brings us to the conclusion of part 3 of this series of videos. If you guys enjoyed or benefited from them, make sure to leave a like and comment. Comment if you have any other questions you'd like to discuss so I can get to them, inshallah. والسلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.
اتسم واستقال ودور الأمجاد طال ما تولى ما توالى بادلا نفس ومالا طال إليك شهابا يلهي بالأرض اشتعالا في غبار الحرب يبدو مثل